The more evidence we have, the better it will be for our community.
Well, as the second sitting week of the fortnight gets underway, let's bring in our political panel, and I'm joined at Parliament by Victorian Liberal Senator James Paterson, and from his electorate office in Melbourne, Labor MP Daniel Mulino. Welcome to you both.
Thank you.
Now, I want to get into the Victorian lockdown in just a moment, but just picking up on this amendment that Rex Patrick is trying to move in the Senate to this COVID business support package. Daniel Mulino, just starting with you, that was a pretty some fiery words we heard from Rex Patrick there. Why did Labor put up a fight on this only to fold now?
Well, look, we've said right from the start that JobKeeper should have been better designed, that the impacts of the COVID recession have been very uneven, and that some firms actually did very well throughout it. And what we've seen is that some firms came out of this with higher profits and actually paying corporate bonuses. So we've said right from the start that firms should look at their actions, should look at whether they needed JobKeeper and pay it back if they didn't need it. Now, his bill would have usefully added a lot of transparency and put some pressure on. Now, this is not about politics. This is ultimately about the fact that we didn't want to hold up much needed disaster payments to people. So we did support the amendment. We would have preferred it to go through. But first and foremost, in this time of national crisis, we're not going to stand in the way of people getting disaster payments they need.
Sure, but it's not the first time Labor has done this. You've picked a fight in the Senate, stood up for something that the party believes in, only to then fold when it actually comes down to the vote. Are you worried that there is a perception emerging here, just as Rex Patrick said, that you do swerve in the game of chicken?
No, I think with matters like this, where it's a matter of people in dire need, because we've got lockdowns of over half the country at the moment, I think where people desperately need payments to put food on the table, to make mortgage payments, people wouldn't want us holding up those payments over amendments, as worthwhile as they might be. I think people understand that with a constructive opposition, we put amendments forward to important bills. But fundamentally, what people want us to be doing is to making sure that payments get out the door.
All right, well, James Paterson, let's bring you in. The Coalition was so scathing of many of Labor's spending measures after the GFC, describing a lot of the spending as wasteful. How then can the Coalition defend the JobKeeper wage subsidy scheme, knowing that a lot of businesses actually made money from it?
Well, Jane, I can actually bring breaking news to you and your viewers, having just come from the Senate chamber, having voted on that amendment. Rex Patrick's amendment was unsuccessful, and the Labor Party did vote with the Coalition.
Thank you for the update.
Foreshadowed that they would, not to insist on it. To answer your question, let's go back and think about where we were in March and April last year, standing on the precipice, looking forward and not knowing what would happen, where the world would go. We had just learned about this emerging virus. We'd learned that it was having a devastating effect around the world, not just on people's lives, but on their livelihoods. And the government very quickly brought together a world-leading package of income support that we now know saved literally millions of jobs. 3 million people were supported on this program. And as a result of the successes of this program, 1 million new jobs have been added since the end of it. I mean, that is a phenomenally positive series of results. Now, of course, I'm someone who very much cherishes taxpayer dollars and doesn't want them spent anywhere that they're not necessary, so that they can be returned to taxpayers, those people who earn them in the first place. But I mean, what else could anyone have done in that period of uncertainty that we're in?
Do you acknowledge now, though, going into the next election, Senator Paterson, that given the amount of money that's had to be spent to help prop up the economy, but along with that, the money that has not necessarily been as well targeted as it should be, that this whole notion of a debt and deficit debate really has been diminished throughout this pandemic?
Well, on the contrary, Jane, I actually believe that fiscal responsibility is more important than ever. We spent what we had to spend to get Australia through the crisis last year and this year. We spent what we needed to on vaccines. We spent what we needed to on income and job support. But a serious amount of debt has been accrued, and it will have to be managed, and it will eventually have to be paid back. And the Australian people thinking towards the next election should think, who is the party best placed to do that?
But can you really say that, though, when we're looking at debt and deficit levels that were rightly or wrongly racked up by the Coalition?
Well, I think, but that's the key question. Were they rightly or wrongly? Was it wrongly racked up? I don't think it was wrongly racked up. I think it was racked up for a very good purpose. But that doesn't mean that discipline isn't now required to pay it back. In fact, better discipline is now required on the other side of this than ever before. And who's going to be better placed to provide that discipline than the Coalition? I don't think any other party can claim that they'll be better managers of this issue than we have been.
And Daniel Mulino, what's your reply to that?
Well, we supported JobKeeper. In fact, we called for it at a time when the government was saying it was not sensible and it was impossible. Look, we would say that overall, the JobKeeper scheme did achieve a lot. But, $4.6 billion, and this is coming from the PBO, $4.6 billion in just 3 months going to firms whose turnover was increasing. And we're seeing many instances of firms who are paying corporate bonuses now who receive significant amounts of JobKeeper. So I do think it's a bit rich for this government to claim that it's a paragon of fiscal virtue. We did support active government engagement, but this is the same party that just a decade ago went on and on and on about a very measured response that was world leading when it came to the GFC. They turned on a dime, and now we're looking at all sorts of waste, which nothing like this was shown during the response to the GFC. And they're still claiming that they're paragons of fiscal virtue. I don't think it washes.
All right, we're just putting politics aside for one moment. You're both Victorian MPs or politicians. I'm just sticking with you for a moment, Daniel Mulino. You're in Melbourne itself, in your 6th lockdown. Just want to know, what's the feeling there? How frustrated, how tired are people? What are you hearing?
Look, there is frustration, but I think people also understand with this highly transmissible Delta virus that you need to go hard and you need to go early. So I think people understand that it's necessary. I myself am engaged in homeschooling. I tend to get physical education and maths for my grade 1 daughter, and my wife gets reading and writing, so that probably shows a bit of our comparative advantage. Look, it's tough, especially with things like homeschooling, but I'm very confident that we'll knock this outbreak on the head. We've already knocked one Delta outbreak on the head here in Victoria. It's tough but necessary.
And James Paterson, I think there's pretty much a consensus now that when it comes to Delta, going hard, going early is the right approach here, which is what Premier Dan Andrews has done, but still wouldn't necessarily lessen, the feeling of fatigue that I'm sure a lot of Victorians are feeling right now.
That's exactly right, Jane. I know that the 5th and 6th lockdowns in Melbourne in particular have hit pretty hard because all Victorians hoped after last year that that period of lockdowns was behind us and we wouldn't have to do that again this year. But unfortunately, the virus has evolved. It is more infectious. It is more transmissible. And until we achieve the levels of vaccination coverage that we know we need, we are going to have, unfortunately, some instances of lockdown. But the positive news is that the vaccine rollout really is accelerating. It's really picking up speed. And people are continuing to come forward in record numbers to line up for their vaccinations. And I encourage your viewers, if you haven't done so yet, please do so, because it will protect you, it'll protect your family and your community, and it will offer all of us the best chance we have of getting beyond this and getting back to the lives that we're much more used to enjoying.
Well, sticking with the vaccine rollout, James Paterson, where do you stand on businesses mandating vaccines for their employees? I'm not talking about aged care homes, I'm talking about a company like SPC has done.
I think some of these businesses are getting a little bit ahead of themselves because not all their employees will be yet eligible to be vaccinated and have not yet had the opportunity to be vaccinated. As it stands from a Commonwealth legislative point of view, we don't believe there's any legislative change that is necessary, and we don't propose any legislative change to make it mandatory. The current status quo is that businesses have to consider their own circumstances and whether or not doing so would be necessary for their workforces. So, as you say, there are some businesses where it will be obviously necessary, like aged care and other healthcare settings. But businesses need to carefully consider beyond that whether or not it is reasonably necessary for them to operate their business safely to mandate it of their workers.
So do you think that as we get towards the end of the year, though, if there is a low uptake in certain companies, that they should have the right to mandate vaccines?
It will depend on the circumstances.
Okay.
In some businesses it might be necessary to do that, but in others it may not be.
And Daniel Mulino, there's some frustration from the business community that at National Cabinet they've basically recommended companies carefully navigate existing workplace laws. So the state and Commonwealth governments are saying it's up to companies. Is that fair?
Well, look, can I just firstly say that I and Labor are on the same page when it comes to we need to encourage people to get vaccinated. Everybody's on the same page. That's very much a cross-party bipartisan goal. But when it comes to mandating vaccination in the workplace, it goes without saying, a very complicated issue. And look, I'll agree that it's really horses for courses. And we wish in some ways that it was simpler. But I think fundamentally, employers need to engage in discussions with their workplaces, with their employees, with unions. And I think discussions in most situations are going to get us a long way there. I think what's dangerous is if employers unilaterally put out a communication around mandating vaccinations that's not going to get us to where we want to be, I don't think, generally.
All right. And just before question time, I just wanted to ask you both a question heading overseas. India, very much in the news. We understand India has sent a naval ship to conduct naval exercises in the South China Sea, one of the first times this has happened. Just sticking with you for a moment, Daniel Mulino, what is behind this? Is this a sort of a show of force against the countering the rise of China?
Well, look, I wouldn't frame it that way. I mean, I personally would say that I support Australia's growing engagement with the Quad, and I think that I support India's right to engage in exercises in the South China Sea in a way that is consistent with international law. So I would frame it in that way, and I don't think there's anything really more to it than that. And I hope that over coming years we can engage in an ever deeper way with other parties in the Quad.
And James Paterson, just finishing with you, what do you think this is a demonstration of? And while I have you, your former Prime Minister Tony Abbott was in India last week talking trade. Is that more about strategic relationship than trade?
Look, I really welcome the Indian Navy's intention to sail through the South China Sea. It is consistent with the United Nations law and the Convention of the Sea, and Australia's partners are all welcome and encouraged to do so because it upholds the fact that the South China Sea are international waters and that regular operations through the South China Sea are nothing other than normal. The Australian Navy regularly transits through the South China Sea, and others should feel free to do so. It was really important that former Prime Minister Tony Abbott visited India last week and met with the Indian Prime Minister Modi. It is a good step towards, I hope, a medium-term goal of a free trade agreement between India and Australia that has obvious economic benefits to both of our countries, but yes, it also has strategic benefits as well. It's part of our efforts to liberalise our international trade and diversify our international trade to make sure that we're not dependent on any one customer, but particularly that we're not dependent too much on China, given that they have waged a campaign of economic coercion against Australia.
And by medium-term goal, James Paterson, you're talking sort of in the next few years. There's not any deal that's imminent between the two countries when it comes to trade?
Well, I think it's at its early stages. I think it is an ambition on the medium term on behalf of both of our governments, but it's a complex thing. It's not a straightforward thing to do. India does not engage in free trade agreements with many other countries. It would be a relatively path-breaking development for them to engage in. So we're working towards that on a medium-term goal.
Okay, James Paterson and Daniel Mulino, thank you for your time today.